Hi, this video is for all my Omar Vision game campers, and this video is going to go over what we did on day 3 and 4 of the game camp. So what I wanted to do on day 3 and 4 was teach the game campers about adding in an enemy character, or a character basically that's controlled by AI instead of by the player. So what we were going to do first was something like this scene here, where this black character with the white eyeball, is an enemy AI character, and it's deciding where to move and how to move around the scene by a script, not by a user controlling the character. So first task of day 3 was to just set something up like this, just to set up this one AI character that can move around the scene. So let's see how we did this. This here is a scene. I called it one enemy. And by default, all scenes have a camera and a light. And then I added a ground, which is just a plane, and I renamed it to ground. And then I put a material on it that I made that's blue, and for the floor. Here's the enemy object. Before I get to that, let me just say what the obstacles are. Now, in the previous week for day 1 and 2, we had made these different objects that we could put in the scene, and they all had rigid bodies so that they would have physics and you could push them and they could drop. So these are just some basic objects like that with rigid bodies in the scene, all these yellow objects. And if something hits them, they could be pushed and moved. So they're simply objects with a rigid body and a collider. And I just grouped all the objects in under a parent object called obstacles. And the reason I did that was just tidy up the hierarchy window. So I could shut them down like this, and the hierarchy window looks nice and neat. So how did I do this? This is called, let's do this, say, for example, for 3 more objects, right? Let's say I wanted to make a empty game object. Now, I kind of went quickly, but the empty game object here is the first thing, create empty. So it comes up, and if I select the empty game object, you can see that all it has is a transform. So first thing I did was I reset the transform so it's at 0, 0, 0, the center of my scene. And to this empty game object, I could call it stuff, because I'm going to put some other game objects inside it. So let's put in there, to put game objects inside stuff, I could right click on stuff, and then I could add an object. I could add a, I don't know, sphere. Okay. And there you see it's there. It's a child of stuff. Or I could add an object here outside of there, a cylinder. And you see this cylinder is not a child of stuff. It's outside of it. It's not indented in. But I could drag it and drop it and make it a child of the stuff. So now these 2 objects are children of stuff. What does that mean? That just means that when I uncheck stuff, then everything that's part of it goes away. If I check it in, then they come back in. I also could click on this triangle to shrink it down to nothing, or open it up to see what's inside. Another thing, when objects are children of another object, stuff, let's say stuff here is the parent. If I move stuff, then all the children move with it. If I rotate stuff, then the children rotate with it. And if I scale stuff, then the children scale with it. So basically, when something's a child of another thing, then when I do something to the parent, that same thing happens to everything underneath it. And that's an important feature to remember for what I'm going to show you later on in this video, with making the player be able to play from a first-person point of view, and to look around look around up and down with the mouse. That's something to remember. All right. So anyway, I could get rid of this. And that's what I did with the obstacles. I put them all in here just to tidy up. And then I just put this one cylinder here in the scene. And the reason for that is part of me explaining what a nav mesh is. Okay, so to get the enemy over here has a couple of things on him or her. It has some child objects. But you can see when I click on enemy that it's basically this capsule is outlined. And then there's a child object that I'm calling the eye. So you could see which way the enemy's facing. And that's just basically a sphere that I put in there. And then there's this other child object I called visual range. And it looks like it's a sphere, but it's not being rendered. It's just the outline of a sphere. And this visual range is basically, it was an empty game object that I added to enemy. I right-clicked and I said create empty. And then I renamed that empty game object visual range by clicking on the word part, which allows me to change the text here. And then I added a sphere collider to the empty game object. So I just went add component, physics, and where's that sphere collider? To add the sphere collider. And that gave me a circle. Now I positioned the circle by clicking on this. I could change properties of the circle with these little squares that are there, like these little dots at the intersections. Or I could do it with these values here, like the center of the circle. I could change, I can move it up and down. And I could also change the size of the circle here with the radius. And the only question is, why did I put this circle here? I put this collider circle in here for the enemy because I'm going to use this collider circle so that when the enemy's moving around the scene, that if something hits the collider, I'll basically say that the enemy sees that object. So you see this enemy right here is moving around, and when it gets to this point, like right here, and this yellow cube hits the collider, I'll say that the enemy could see that yellow cube. But if the enemy has something beside it, it doesn't see it. If the enemy has something behind it, it doesn't see it. You could sneak up behind him. That's why the collider, I moved it in front of the enemy a little bit and not like directly on him. So I'm going to use this collider as the enemy's sense of awareness of what's around him. Whenever something hits the collider, the enemy will be aware of that thing. Now there's two kinds of colliders because when we made these cubes here, they have colliders on them and rigid bodies, and when you hit them, when you touch them, they were moving out of the way. But we don't want things to move out of the way with our enemy's sphere collider. We just want to know when things hit the collider. So I take that sphere collider here. Let me click on the visual range thing. And here on the sphere collider, I click this button here for is trigger. I click the is trigger checkbox, and that means that it will just detect when something comes in range, but it won't do the physics where it's pushing things out of the way. So if I press play here and the trigger is checked, you're going to see that the enemy's moving, and if it gets close to any of these checkboxes, they're not actually going to move, you see? But the eye turns red, it does know that the thing's close. Compared to if I turn the sphere collider into a collider that's not a trigger, let's see what happens. Let's see as it gets close to an object. You see how that square moved? It's moving because the enemy has the sphere collider in collision mode instead of a trigger. And that's a cool thing if that's what you want to go for, but I didn't want to go for that, so I'm going to change my visual range. It's going to be a trigger instead. So anyway, that's the game objects that make up my enemy, but there's some more things involved. There's a script involved, which I'll explain after I explain something else in the scene. And there's also Unity has an AI element called a nav mesh, a navigation mesh. So this blue surface here, this is the ground, and I'm gonna basically create a nav mesh onto this blue surface. So what I'd have to do is go to Window, AI, Navigation to open up the navigation window. And the navigation window has a couple of buttons here, and I'm interested in clicking on the Bake button. And right now you can see that I do have a nav mesh. All these like highlighted areas in blue, that's a nav mesh. But I could clear it, and now there is no nav mesh. Then when I press Bake, Unity is going to calculate all the areas where the enemy is going to be able to move. It calculated into the nav mesh any objects that are static. So these blue cubes, they are, if I look back in the inspector, at the top here, they are not static. They are going to be moving around in the scene. But if I click on the ground, I have the static checked. And if I click on this white cylinder, I have static checked. So no matter where I put this cylinder in my scene, and no matter how I make it, I make it, that it's static. When I go back to my navigation window and see, that was the previously baked nav mesh, but now I'm going to bake it with the objects in the new position. I'll press bake, and now it recalculates the areas where the enemy is going to be able to move, or anything that has a nav mesh agent will be able to move. So that's step one. I bake a nav mesh. Now step two, my enemy has a special component on it. So let me select my enemy, and there's a special component that I added called a nav mesh agent. And to add this component, I clicked add component, blah, 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 blah. Where are you? Navigation and nav mesh agent to add this nav mesh agent component. Oops, I just closed it. Let me open it up. So if my game object has a nav mesh agent component and there's a nav mesh in my scene, then my enemy is going to be able to be told, go here, and the nav mesh agent will automatically move your object there. Then I could tell it to go here, give it the position, and the enemy will move to that position. Which brings me to the third part, is the script. So in the script over here, the AI controller script, here it is that I added to the enemy. Let's take a look at it. It's not that big. In the AI controller script, first thing I had to do is using Unity Engine. That's just so I could code for the Unity stuff. And then I added a special other set of code called unityengine.ai, and that's for the navmesh agent. These little statements up here before I say public class, these are just saying that when I drag and drop the script onto the game object, that it's going to make sure it has a navmesh agent, a rigid body, and a collider component. And if they're not there when I drag the script on to the game object, then they will be added automatically. Okay, in my AI controller script, I have 3 public variables. That's so that the user could set them easily in the inspector window here. And the first one is ground, to see what the ground is that I'm going to be moving over. Then I have a float, which is the distance threshold as the game object moves from place to place. When it gets close to the spot, how close does it have to get before I say, okay, you're on that spot? So I say when it gets close as 0.1. And then time threshold is just in case I get stuck in any other way, that after 5 seconds it picks a new point to move to. Okay? Now, in my script, I have some private variables that I use to keep track of things. I have the navmesh agent to refer to the navmesh agent component, so I could give commands to it to move here, move here, move here, move here. I have the rigid body. I have a float for mark for marking the time, so I could see how much time passed between the mark time and if it's 5 seconds yet. And then I also have the game object eye and the renderer for the eye. And why do I have that? That's because when the enemy's moving around, his eye turns red when something collides with the sphere collider. So in order to turn that eye red, I need to have a pointer to the eye in my script. Okay, so now I have all the variables of my AI controller. Now, the first thing is, what do I do when the script starts up? Okay, so first thing I do is I have to get a pointer to the navmesh agent, the rigid body. I also tell the rigid body to constrain rotations so it doesn't fall over on itself, so he keeps standing up, because the bottom of him is a spherical shape. It's rounded, so I don't want the agent to fall over. And then I get a pointer to the eye. So I get a pointer to the eye without having it here in the inspector window where you drag and drop it. I get a pointer to the eye by looking at the transform of my enemy object, the parent object, the transform of that, and then I find an object with the name eye. And then from that, I return the game object, and now I have the game object eye. Okay, and then with the eye, I just get the renderer. The renderer is responsible for how the game object draws, so that's what I'll use to change the color. Okay, now there's something else over here I just want to mention. Here, for the ground public variable that you're setting in the inspector, this is not going to be a game object. This is going to be a renderer for ground. And I drag and drop this variable, and over here you can see that Unity accepts it. I could drag and drop it, even though ground is a full-on game object with all these components to it. The thing is, since ground does have the component of a renderer right here, when I drag and drop ground onto the ground inspector variable, it sees that it does have a renderer, and it uses the renderer to set my renderer. Just something to note. So anyway, the start function sets all my private variables. And the update function is going to see if I reached my destination or not, basically. All right, so the update function is just going to be running along 60 frames a second or whatever, and it's going to check to see if my navmesh agent, the remaining distance to get to its destination, is less than the threshold. Did I get there? And it's also going to check to see if the time expired, 5 seconds. Like what I had up here is 5 seconds. Or if mark equals a -1, because over here, when the game first starts, mark is equal to -1, and I will have to call pick random destination at least once to start moving. So basically, this just checks to see if I have to pick somewhere to move. I'm going to pick somewhere to move randomly if I reached my previous location, if the time is greater than 5 seconds, or if mark equals -1. These double bars are ways of saying if this or this or this are true. Okay, so now picking a spot to move to. Here I pick a spot over the ground. So let's think of the axes. We have the Z and the X, which is basically moving across the floor. See, the Z and the X axis. And Y is up and down off the floor. So for Z and X, I pick a random value between the ground's minimum X and the ground's bound maximum X. The same thing for the Z's. And then for Y, I just pick it to be above the ground. Then I use these 3 points to make a vector 3 destination point. Then I tell, this is the command that sets my enemy to move. I use the navmesh agent dot set destination, and then I give it a point, a vector 3. As soon as I give this command, my enemy will start moving toward the destination. And then here I mark the time that I gave this destination. I just mark it as time.time, so I can tell when 5 seconds elapsed. Now these two functions here, these are events, onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit. Now just like start is blue and update are blue over here because they're part of the mono behavior that our class is inheriting from, these functions are also blue because they're part of the mono behavior class that our script is inheriting from. And what they're event handlers. Like onTriggerEnter handles the event of any collider that my object has that's trigger went off. Since I set the sphere to be a trigger, I use the onTriggerEnter. So something entered my sphere collider, and that something is defined right here. So here I just make sure my I and my iRend are actually set. I did set them over here in the start, but I'm just making sure they're set. And then simply this line here, iRend material set color sets the eyeball to red. And then here on the trigger exit, that means an object that came into the sphere has now come out of the sphere collider. So that's the exit event. On trigger exit event, I turn the eye back to color white. So, that's basically my trigger, my AI controller to move my enemy around and change his eye color. And you can find the script on omervision.com. But let's see, that's how we have this one player moving around. Now, we make one player, one enemy object here that's going to be moving around, and we set him up, everything's set up the way we want. As we can see, we tested him and he's able to move around the scene. Now I could take that player, that game object, and make something called a prefab out of him. So in this scene, I may be able to use enemy more than once by just like pressing Control D and making a copy and doing this. But what about if I wanted to use the object in another scene that's not this one? I'd have to have some way to get this enemy into another scene without making him all over again. So that way is to take that game object and drag and drop it into the assets window, and that basically makes a prefab out of it. What a prefab is now that this game object is down here in my assets window, if I make another level and stuff like that, I don't have to put all these things together again. I just drag and drop it and it will start behaving right away. So let's do that. Let's go now and try. This was making one enemy move around the scene. Let's do another scene. And in the next scene, we're going to do a scene where there's multiple enemies that are going to move around the scene. So here we have, I just double clicked on my multiple enemy scene. And now you can see here it's multiple enemy is the one that opened up. And you can see I have my obstacles here and everything. But there's no enemy object in the scene now. Instead, I have this was a empty game object called enemies that I added the enemies script to. Okay, so as a matter of fact, I could just do that again here. So you can see how I did it. This was a new scene. I put the ground in, I put the obstacles in, and what I did was I right-clicked game object, create empty, and here I click on the word and I type enemies. Okay, let me just reset the position to 0, 0, 0. So here's empty game object enemies, and then I have a script here, enemies, that I'm going to drag and drop onto it, and this script is going to create the enemies in the scene for me. All it needs to know is how many enemies it wants me to create, what is the prefab to use for the enemy. Well, we just made a prefab there, so I'm going to drag and drop that, and it wants to know what the ground is, so I'll drag and drop the ground there. So now if I press play, this script should make 3 enemies, and then the enemies should start behaving just the way they did when we had 1 enemy. So let's see, I press play, and yeah, 3 enemies got made. They are randomly popped up around the scene. and they're moving around. So what happens if I change the count to something like 10 and I press play? Bam! The script makes 10 enemies and they're moving around the scene. What happens if I say, some kids are going to say 100, but I'll just say, I don't know, let's say 50. Whew, could I fit 50 on there? Press play, and boom, there's 50 little AI objects just moving around with their eyeballs turning red when there's something in front of them, and when there's nothing in front of them, their eyeballs are white. It looks very busy. Cool, huh? So now, the only thing different here from our last scene is that I have a script called enemies right here. So let's see what the enemy script has in it that actually put all those enemies on the scene. Double click, and here's my enemy script. And at the top, it's just using the Unity engine. And here's my public class enemies derived off of model behavior. Here's my 3 public variables. Count by default equals 3. Then I have the game object for the enemy prefab, and I have the ground renderer right here. Okay, so I know how big the ground is that I could spawn an enemy over. So in the start function, what's the first thing I do is spawn enemies. I call the spawn enemies function. So in case you're not familiar, in gaming, spawn is like the word that we use to define popping an object into the scene, like, where it kind of like you press play and game objects like come into the scene, or players come into the scene when the game is already running. So in this case, yes, see, the enemies aren't there when the game is stopped, but when I press play, the game is running, boom, and it spawns in all these objects. So excuse me, that's why this function is called spawn enemies. So it's going to have a loop here, and the loop goes from 0 to how many enemies we want to spawn. For I equals 0 to I less than count, I plus plus. So first thing we do is to spawn something into our scene, it's a command called instantiate. Okay, and then when you instantiate something, let's see what it takes. It takes a object, and then if you want this object that you spawned in to have a parent, then you could say then you can give it the transformer of the parent. So all these little enemies are spawning in, and they're going to be children of the enemies game object, like you see here. When I press play, you see how there's a little triangle here, and here's all the enemies that spawned. Their parent is the enemies empty game object. And that's because right here, the script enemies is attached to that enemies game object. So the script is this means the enemies game object, right? Anyway, so here I add a game object to the scene. Its parent is my enemies empty game object. Then here I just set the name of it to be the name of whatever the prefab is. And we see our prefab here has a name enemy plus I, whatever I equals 0, 1, 2, 3. But since I is a number, I have to convert it to a string. Since this is a string, you can see it in blue. It says string object name. Name is already a string, but I is an int, so I just convert it to string. And that gives the names for all my enemies. That's not important for the game to function, but it just makes it easier to read. And now I get a reference to the script of the enemy game object. And I do it like this. So here's my enemy game object that I just instantiated. And then from that, I get the component AI controller. Right? Because on our enemy, if you click on the prefab here, you can see our enemy has the AI controller script. All right, where am I? I lost my spot. I lost my spot. All right, so I get a pointer to the script, and then to the script, I tell it what the ground is. I say this dot ground equals the ground. And I have to do this because in the prefab, it's not in the scene yet. See right here when I click on the enemy prefab that the ground is not set. It doesn't have a value yet. I would have to drag the ground and put it on there so that the enemy knows what the ground is. So basically that's what this is doing. It gets a pointer to the script of the newly spawned enemy, and then it sets the ground variable equal to the same ground variable that the enemy's object has. There, now it's going to have its ground set. And then to start off, I'm going to have to give it a position in the scene. So the enemy's going to have a position, and I'm going to have to pick a random point to put it over. So I almost use the same kind of random position thing that I used in the AI controller. I had this function here to pick a random destination. So it's the same thing here. In my enemy script, I'm just going to pick a random spawn point. So again, I use the size of the ground in the X and the Y axis, and I just make sure that the Y point is above the ground. And then I say that that's my point that I want to spawn at, and I return that value. Okay, so when I pick a random spawn point, that sets the position. And that's basically it. That's how I spawn all those enemies in there. That's not that bad, you know? So there you go. Like, so in day 3, we kind of figured out how to make some enemies, how to make them move around randomly, etc., etc. They're busy little people. And now I'm going to show you what we did on day 4, is we try to put together what we did from day 1 and 2. Day 1 and 2, we kind of had a scene like this with some objects in it. And we had put a player in the scene that we could move around with the keyboard. All right, day 4, we're going to take a little bit more advanced step with that. So here, day 4, let me open up my player shoot scene. Okay, so here we still have the yellow obstacles in the scene. We still have the ground. And this guy here in the middle, he's a player. I made him look kind of like the enemy, except the only thing is I changed his colors around from white with a black eye. Okay, so the player here, he has the eye and the capsule, and he has another object here, the camera. But let's say the camera, this could turn the camera on and off, on and off. Let's say we leave it off first and I press play. What we did was we changed the script from day 2. So here I press the arrow keys to move forward or backward. So I'm moving forward, and then I could use the other arrow keys to turn left and right while I'm moving forward and backward. So that's a little different than what we did on day 2, where we just had the keys, strafing him forward, back, left, and right. Here I could rotate him left and right, and then I can move forward or backward. That's with the camera off. And then I have this extra thing here where I could turn the camera on, and this is going to give us a first-person point of view. So when I drag the camera here on the player, I had to position the camera kind of like about where his eye is, okay? And then this is basically what I'm going to see here. I want to see from the point of view of the player, so I put the camera right about where his eye is, and I made it a child of the player. So remember, I was just showing you before, if something's a child of the player, it moves with the player. You see how the camera's moving, even though I selected player. And also, that will rotate left and right with the player. See, I'm rotating the player and the camera's rotating with it. That's an important factor, because when we're moving the player and we turn around, we want the camera to turn around and show what we're looking at. So now I have the player and I have the camera turned on. And now I press play. Let's see what happens. Now the script is giving us the point of view from the player, like we're in the scene. And the movement controls are the same. I can move forward and backward. And I could what am I doing here? Oh, I'm not rotating now. I'm strafing left and right, moving forward and backward. And to rotate, I'm going to move my mouse. Here I move my mouse left and right to look around. And I move my mouse up and down to look up and down. See, a little different now. So let me press escape, and there. So how do we do these changes to the player? Well, other than making the object, it's all done with the player move script that I added to player. So you can see right down here, there's the player move script. Okay, so let's take a look first at the player move script. This player has 2 different scripts added onto it. One is to move the player, and another script is actually to shoot some shots. But let's look at the move script first, because the movements are a little bit different than the simple forward, back, left, and right that we had from day 2. Here on day 4, let's see, some things are the same. We make sure the player has a rigid body. And then over here, we have a move speed, turn speed. And here's a difference. We have a camera variable. All right. I'll talk about the shot pool when we do the shot script later. Boo, boo, boo. Then here in the start, we set the camera equal to the player get component and children camera. So this is going to see if the player has a camera child object. So here's my player, and here's my camera child object. So that's get component in children, get the camera component. So if it does have a child object, then cam will not be null. And I also want to make sure that camera is enabled. So remember over here, camera is enabled with a checkbox, and camera is disabled without the checkbox. So it's making sure that 1, I have a camera as a child, and 2, that this checkbox is on. All right, so if those things are true, then I'm going to turn off all the other cameras. What other cameras are in the scene? Let's see here. What other cameras do we have? We have here the main camera, the one that we're looking at right here. This is the main camera. Okay, so when we play the game, we don't want to have 2 cameras on at the same time, because cameras also have these things called audio listeners, which when we start having sound, you can only have one thing listening for sound, and you want to have one thing also looking into your scene. So if the player has a camera, we're going to look through the player's eyes. We're not going to use this camera, so we'll turn it off. So I wrote this function called turn off other cameras. Okay, and then I lock the cursor to the window. So what this does, locking the cursor to the window, if you notice when I press play, you see my cursor's here, but as soon as the game starts, my mouse cursor, it disappears. You can't see the arrow anymore. But that's helpful for me looking around to not see the cursor, because if I did see the cursor, oops, I just showed you right here what it was going to look like. Here, I move around without the cursor, but if I did see the cursor, let me put the cursor back, then when I'm moving around, I see that little mouse arrow moving around. It kind of, distracts me from the game. So the way I hide that cursor is I turn cursor lock state equal to locked, and it locks the cursor into the game window, and you can't see it anymore. Then over here, I get the rigid body and make sure I don't fall down. Okay. Freeze the rotations. And then here's the update function. So the update function, this is the player move script. I'm going to do movement. So if the camera's null, then it moves by moving forward and back and turning left and right. That's this one, if the camera is null. But I do have a child camera, so it's going to use this one over here, where it looks first to see if I press the escape key, and then it unlocks the cursor. That's why I just showed you this. I pressed play, and the cursor was gone, and then I just pressed the escape key, and boop, I got my cursor back. So that's what that does. It brings back the cursor. And then movement is, I'm going to use the horizontal and vertical to actually move my player to the left and the right, or forward and backward. So that's over here when I was playing the game. I'm not touching the mouse. I'm just moving forward and backward, and then I can move left and right. So that's what those first 2 commands are here. Then over here with the look, I'm going to use the mouse. So if you move the mouse in the X or the mouse up and down, then you're going to look. I'm going to rotate the player left and right, or rotate the camera up and down. And the reason I did it on 2 separate objects is to keep the angles kind of clean, So I have one object controlling rotation left and right, and the other object is going to look up and down. The camera's going to look up and down. So then, there we go. That's the new moves for when the camera's on. And how did we turn off the cameras, right? Because over here I had turn off other cameras. Let's go to definition. That's right here in the script. Basically, before I turn off all the cameras, I make sure that we did define our child camera here, that we did have one. And then I use this camera.allCameras thing, which returns to me all the enabled cameras that are in the scene. So we have two cameras here, main camera and camera. So as I'm going through a loop, this is a for each loop instead of a for loop. I could say for each camera object, which I'm going to call C, in this collection of all cameras, I'm going to see what the first one is and see if the name equals the name of my camera. And if it doesn't equal the name, then I'll disable the camera and I'll disable the audio listener. That's how I turned off the other cameras. Okay, so that explains the player and the player move. Just a little bit different than just moving forward and backward, left and right. Now, this player script is kind of advanced because it has two different modes. If the camera's on, if the camera's off, it has two different ways to control here in the update function. Okay, now the other thing we could do when we press play is we could shoot. So here my camera's on and I'm looking around and the shooting's going to happen basically in the middle of the screen. The shots are going to come out. Boom, right? And that's just looking straight ahead. I could also look more to the floor and I could also look up to the sky. Wherever I'm looking, the middle of the screen, that's where my shots are going. Okay? So how do I do that? Well, I got two different things that I'm doing here. I have, let's take it step by step. First of all, I have to make the shots. Those little black balls that are shooting out, I have to make them. So I here have a shot prefab. But the way I made this shot is like this. Say I make a new scene here, and I'm going to make what I'm going to call a shot, which is, I'll just make it a sphere, okay? And then the sphere, I want it to constantly move in the forward direction. That's all its job is to move forward, all right? So what I did was I took this shot and I made a script for it. I'm going to put the script on the sphere. And here's the script. So the script takes the move speed and how long the shot will exist moving forward. And if I look at the shot script, let's see what it has in it. I make sure I have a rigid body and a collider. So when I did drag the shot script on, it did add a rigid body. And here's the public variables. Here's the mark so I can see when 3 seconds passes by. I get some pointers to the components. And the first thing I do is I set the pointers to the components of my game object. And I freeze the rotations and I don't use gravity. I turn gravity off for the shot. So it doesn't fall down, it just goes forward without falling down with gravity. Now in the update function, this here is the command that just keeps it moving forward. Just update will keep moving forward, forward, forward until the time runs out, the 3 seconds runs out, okay? Otherwise, if the 3 seconds runs out, this is an if else. So if 3 seconds runs out, then it's going to pool the object. So pooling is a thing where the object's always in the scene, but every time I press to shoot something, it doesn't have to instantiate the object into the scene. They're already there. It saves time. Anyway, so here's a script that I just attached. So when I set it to pooled, basically what I'm doing is turning off the collider and I'm turning off the renderer. I don't want it to interact with anything in the scene. And I reset the time. When I fire a shot, I need a source and a target. I need a source where it's going to start from and a target to where it's going to go to. And I make sure that the object isn't showing and the collider's off. I make sure that the object is pooled before I actually unpool it and set the time. And this is a little thing to catch if it hits anything, but I don't have any code in there yet. All right, so here I am with the player move, and I'm going to show the shooting. Well, we showed the shooting happening, and we showed the shoot script. So every time I press play, a shot's going to come out, and all the shot has to do is keep moving forward until it shoots. So now, at the end of day 4, we had enemies that could move around. We had a player that could happen. So if I try to put the two things together and make a level out of them, that would be me clicking this level scene here. So with the level, I still had my objects, and I just made a new kind of object called a tree, which the tree is basically this over here. And it's just two shapes put together, a cylinder and a sphere shape, just to make it look a little bit more like a scene. So here's my player with its scripts on for player move and shot pool. And here's my enemies, empty game object. And let's see what it just needs to know what the enemy prefab is. So let me just drag and drop that there. I'm just going to make 10 enemies. So now if I press play, I'll have the enemies moving around and I'll have myself moving around when I press play. Here I am. Let me look up and I can see all the enemies moving around. I can move around too. I could shoot things and they move, and I see what happens. I shoot an enemy, they kind of move out of the way. So now we have enemies moving around, a player moving around, a player shooting, and that's the end of day 4, what we should have. There we go.